delighted to welcome an old friend from the UK, Professor Gavin Hilson, who is really one of the leading scholars in the field of artisanal and small-scale mining worldwide. Gavin and I first interacted through a World Bank initiative called CHASM, the Communities and Small-Scale Mining Effort, which was started over a decade ago and did some good work in terms of knowledge exchange in a sector which had been neglected for many years. And Gavin at the time was really a pioneer in trying to bring this whole issue to global attention. And he comes from a technical background. He has a PhD from the Imperial College of Science in the UK, originally from Canada, and a North American connection as well there. And he's, his earlier studies were in Toronto. He's from the Toronto area. But then he applied that technical knowledge within a social context in quite a unique way, and has been a prolific writer and put together initially a couple of anthologies on small-scale mining, which were, real magnum opus level manuscripts, several hundred pages, getting scholars from all over the world together to think about these issues. Has then also sole-authored many articles in this arena. He's geographically focused on Ghana, but also other parts of the world as well, has extensive field experience. And he's also one of those scholars who's been in the trenches with the miners, spent long field hours actually working there, not the fly-in, fly-out researcher. He's very much someone who has, he has the skill set of an engineer, but the passion of an anthropologist. So it's really a pleasure to welcome you, Gavin. And I'm sure we'll all benefit.
I need to hire you.
Okay.
Yeah, great to be here. I've been on vacation actually in Western Australia. I'm due to give a talk in Perth next week. So when Salim asked me to come and give a talk here, I didn't realize how big Australia was. I was thinking to myself, I'll just hop on my skateboard and come down, Perth to Brisbane. I was like, wow, 5-hour flight. Wow. Anyway, I'm glad to be here. As Salim has said, I do research on artisanal and small-scale mining. What I'm going to talk to you about today is artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM, as we refer to it as, in Sub-Saharan Africa. I spend most of my working life talking to small-scale miners and trying to figure out solutions to their problems. I also spend a lot of my time aggravating donors, NGOs, and government officials. But I'm having fun, so that's all that matters. I just want to start off by making sure we're all on the same page, okay? Despite being defined differently from place to place, or being defined differently from place to place, we've come to use artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM, as a label for all low-tech mineral extraction and processing activity in developing countries. It's typically labor-intensive. It's mainly linked to the extraction of precious metals and stones, but gold panning and extraction is by far the largest branch of this sector. In Sub-Saharan Africa, we don't know how many people are engaged directly in the sector. The World Bank estimates that there's 3 million people engaged directly in the sector in the region. I would say that figure applies to the Democratic Republic of Congo alone. So I'd say that we're dealing with a figure of probably 20 to 40 million people, okay, who are employed directly in the sector, in the region, and that there are 6 times more employed in the downstream industries that it spawns. So what I'm getting at here is, for every individual employed in the sector, there's someone who drives him or her to work, there's someone who feeds him or her, someone who repairs his or her equipment, that kind of thing. Okay? So a lot of people depend on the sector for their livelihoods. Now the impressions kind of conveyed in these pictures here is that the sector is highly disorganized. And if you don't take the time to study it, you will most certainly draw this conclusion. But when you do study it, you come to appreciate how organized it really is. It features a multitude of actors, and it's not disorganized. It's rather very, very informal. Now, the timing of this presentation could not be better. First, I owe someone a book chapter here on this very subject. I think it was due like in the late 90s, but anyway. So hopefully this will provide some kind of reassurance that, as we say in Ghana, I'm on it, okay? And that I am nearing completion. But most importantly, Salim tells me this is a topic of interest here at the center, ASM, that the center is looking to build a program around this, or on this topic. So hopefully today I'll cover some interesting territory and identify some promising areas for research. So I'm going to start off with some random thoughts, okay? Collating some random thoughts, which will hopefully put things into context, okay? Secondly, I'm going to reflect on 4 decades of support for this sector in Sub-Saharan Africa, okay? Now, the general theme here is that the policy discourse is not in tune with the realities on the ground. And there are reasons why, okay? And I'm going to tell you why. Then I'm going to conclude with a couple case studies to illustrate more clearly how things have played out, okay? A bit about myself. As Salim's indicated, I trained originally in geosciences, but I've since branched out into the social sciences. I've been studying the sector in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular for over a decade. And during this time, I've fought quite hard to get ASM more coverage in the development literature. And during this time, I've seen ASM gain increasing attention and begin to be embraced much more positively in policy. But it has not been nearly enough, and we need more of you doing research in this very, very interesting area. I've devoted my career to broadening understanding of the dynamics of this neglected sector of industry. So this presentation is as much an insight into my research career as it is about donor rate for artisanal and small-scale mining in Sub-Saharan Africa. Let's start off with some random thoughts, okay? The first point is that what we fail to recognize is that these artisanal and small-scale mining populations are very, very eclectic, okay? Very, very heterogeneous. It's one of the few settings in Sub-Saharan Africa, or in fact, probably the developing world, where you can find a trained accountant or a former public sector worker working alongside an illiterate farmer. Each person is there for very different reasons. The former public sector worker is there because, well, he or she has been laid off. The farmer is there because he or she can't afford to buy fertilizers because they're no longer subsidized by the state. This will make a bit more sense later on in the presentation. But looking at an image like this, you could never draw those conclusions unless you study it, okay? Unless you go there and you interact with the people, okay? And when you do, you realize that when it comes to formalizing this sector, when it comes to supporting this sector, there's no room for a one-size-fits-all policy. Second, where's the census? Virtually no census work has been conducted in African small-scale mining regions. And this is really bizarre to me, okay? There's no information, next to no information on people's backgrounds, where they're from, why they're involved in mining altogether, how many people in their families or dependents depend on the industry, okay? Donors have pledged tens of millions of dollars over the years towards supporting small-scale mining in Sub-Saharan Africa. All kinds of donors, okay? USAID, I made sure I mentioned you guys, okay? All kinds of donors, okay? Even the Canadians, where I'm from, okay? So the money is there, but the question is, what are we using it for, okay? So there's been next to no census work undertaken. I'm not saying you have to go in there and count every single person, but how about going into a community and doing a bit of a cross-section analysis or finding out what's going on in a particular area of the community, how many people are there, where they're from, and so on. I just try to relate this to everyday life. I mean, before you go to the grocery store, right? Surely you check your fridge out before you go to the grocery store to figure out what you need, right? Or if you have your car in your garage over the winter, I don't know if you do that here, we do that in Canada. If you have your car in the garage over the winter and you take it out in the spring, surely you take it for a test drive before you repair it, right? You figure things out before, you test things out before you figure out that helps you figure out what you need. But in the case of small-scale mining, it's just really bizarre. You don't go into the community and figure out who's there, what their needs are, etc. You just pledge millions of dollars to kind of supporting this industry without figuring out what these people need, okay, and what their priorities are. A third point, livelihood diversification. A large percentage of people in the sector in Sub-Saharan Africa have branched out from farming into small-scale mining. And again, this will make a bit more sense later on, okay? And they've done so because of very difficult economic circumstances, okay? So in many respects, the people we see in the sector across Sub-Saharan Africa are responding to prevailing economic conditions. Most of the operations we see are unlicensed. There's been extensive coverage of the environmental impacts of these operations, the many social ills associated with their producing communities. But looking at things a bit more sympathetically, these conditions can be understood to be an expression of informality, because the regulatory frameworks in place for small-scale mining region-wide and in many other parts of the world are not in tune with the sector's many nuances, and this will make a bit more sense later on. A fourth thought: don't believe what you read, okay? Artisanal and small-scale mining is by far the most important rural non-farm activity in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in many places in the region, it's the most important economic activity, full stop. Yet it's only been in the past 5 years that this has really been made clear in the literature. You read the wonderful work produced by the likes of Thomas Reardon, by the likes of Deborah Bryson in the 1980s and the 1990s on livelihood diversification in rural Sub-Saharan Africa. These people really popularized the farm, non-farm movement in the region. And ASM is completely overlooked in this literature. It's overlooked in other areas of development as well. Child labor in small-scale mining, for example. The issue of child labor in agriculture in rural Sub-Saharan Africa has been poorly diagnosed or misdiagnosed by the ILO. A lot of the so-called identified child labor taking place in farming in the region is culturally driven and is not adversely impacting on schooling as is believed. But it has been labeled by the International Labour Organization as a worse form of child labor, and so has artisanal and small-scale mining work, despite the fact that many children are moving with their families from the farm to the mine and doing the same kinds of menial tasks. But we don't have this livelihood diversification literature to hook this discussion on. So making a case becomes very, very difficult. In fact, it's very frustrating, because you find yourself meandering in the literature that should be informing your analysis, and you find yourself spending too much time taking 2 steps back, trying to clarify things. You do a search on I'm sure we all know what the Web of Science is, or the Science Citation Index. You do a search on the Web of Science for articles produced on artisanal mining and small-scale mining before 2000, and you retrieve 95 hits. Okay? And these are the categories that the Web of Science kind of puts them in. You got 28 under the category of environment, 32 under mineral processing and extraction, and 6 under construction. All of these pieces are technical pieces. disconnected from anything developmental. The remainder fall into this category, planning and development. Okay? All of the papers that fall into this category, the remaining papers, were published in two journals, Resources Policy and the Natural Resources Forum. Now, up until the mid-1990s, these two journals were strictly policy forums. Okay? Nice descriptions of policy going on in the sector, produced by the likes of Jeff Davidson, Beatrice LeBone, Pierre Traoré, who were around the policy dialogue at the time, but were not true academics, and therefore made very few connections to relevant academic debates on rurality and economic development. So, with no association with development, I'll relate a personal experience of my own here. You have things like this happen, or you had things like this happen. I sent a paper to a journal called World Development, which is a leading development journal, which I've since published in the African Development Review. The paper title, Why is Illegal Gold Mining So Ubiquitous supposed to be in rural Ghana? I sent the paper to the journal, mailed my 4 hard copies to, at the time, American University, where the editor was. 2 months later, they sent me back the same envelope with a letter that said the subject matter is not appropriate for the journal. Okay? Okay, you know, the paper may have been crap, but it's besides the point. But this is what they said. Okay? Why? Because the academic debates had not yet reached the point where they needed to be. Okay? And some of my colleagues at the time had similar experiences trying to get their work on small-scale mining in the leading development journals. Don't worry, I've since published the paper in World Development, so it's okay. Okay, so just some random thoughts to kind of start things off. Let's move on to why, in my view, artisanal and small-scale mining in Sub-Saharan Africa, and perhaps more generally, has failed to garner the attention it deserves on the policy and donor agendas. Over the past 40 years or so, a combination of factors have really worked against this sector of industry from being recognized for what it is in policy and really receiving the credit it deserves in regional development strategies. First, and on a general note, we are fixated on economics. We love economics. Okay? We love the economic data. We're often influenced into thinking that these economic data tell the full story about development. I'm sure all of us have believed in the data to mean more than what they do at some point in our academic careers. Things like GDP per capita, GDP growth, unemployment rate. But they do not. I mean, development is much more than this. Okay? This is why we have the Human Development Index, which is, you know, not the most comprehensive or probably the most effective tools out there, but it's fairly comprehensive. Okay? I mean, if it was just about economic data, then places like Equatorial Guinea and Angola, which have some of the highest incomes per capita in the world, would be developed countries, right? We all know that they have the highest income disparities in the world. Well, for our purposes here, this policy mindset, in my view, has also affected the way in which we look at the performance of mineral economies. We gauge the performance of the mining sector from our successes with taxing large-scale mining enclaves and nothing else. Okay? We have been influenced by the likes of Paul Collier into thinking that the performance of a mineral-rich developing country can be shown and possibly predicted by throwing a bunch of numbers into a model. The reality is that focusing solely or mainly on the economics prevents adequate addressing of what becomes what I refer to as the social dimension of the resource curse. So all these largely unquantifiable, often unanticipated social problems that arise when you simply focus on the taxes and royalties to be derived from the booming large-scale enclaves, but don't pay close enough attention to the adverse impacts of these activities, which can come back to haunt you in the end. Things like resettlement or dislocation or inadequate compensation. And I fit promoting large-scale mining or foreign large-scale mining, foreign finance large-scale mining, or becoming too preoccupied with taxing your large-scale mining enclaves while simultaneously neglecting the importance and potential contribution of ASM in terms of poverty alleviation. I place that into this category as well. Why is this significant? Well, I'm sure most of us know that scores of African governments, the likes of Tanzania, Ghana, Mali, and more recently Mozambique and the DRC, despite having these booming large-scale mining economies, propelled largely by foreign investment, derive very little in the form of taxes and royalties relative to the value of production. In reforming their mineral economies, these countries have loosely followed the blueprints outlined in the landmark World Bank document, A Strategy for African Mining, which was published in 1992, which inexplicably called for reformed mining agendas in the region to treat large-scale mining and artisanal and small-scale mining equally, despite being two very different industries. Okay? A bunch of guys with shovels are very, very different to Barrick Gold and BHP Billiton. It states, and I quote, "There's no good reason to create differential access to mineral rights for different classes of mining investor. A state mining enterprise should compete on the same terms as a privately owned company, foreign on the same terms as national, large companies under the same broad rules as small ones." And furthermore, the original colonial mining laws defined an open system which was drawn up with the small-scale gold rush type operation, then prevalent in mind, and envisaged a negligible economic or technical role for government and provided insufficient rights and obligations for both governments and investors, including inadequate security of tenure for investors willing to undertake the larger mining operations which gradually became important in Africa. But today the reverse is true. A significant share of the revised legislation now in place in Sub-Saharan Africa was drawn up with the large-scale mechanized foreign financed operation in mind and provides insufficient rights and obligations for indigenous small-scale miners. These legislative and policy frameworks have discouraged formalization and have fueled the growth of illegal or informal ASM activities, which are now found scattered throughout the region today. Okay? A second point is that in addition to this, we've been a bit slow out of the gate with artisanal and small-scale mining. I mean, we've had enough time to get things right. Okay? The donor community, the NGO community, governments, academics. Small-scale mining was actually used for the first time in a policy context over 40 years ago in the UN publication, Small-Scale Mining in the Developing Countries. But instead of doing something about it, we spent about 15 years organizing international conferences with the aim of developing universal definitions for small-scale mining. It was what we didn't do in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s that would determine largely its fate and policy. Namely, not recognize that there's a livelihoods dimension in this industry and that in many regions of the world, including Sub-Saharan Africa, it is at the heart of the rural economy. We had a chance to really make an impact early on and after this 15-year period to make up for lost time, but instead the World Bank hired an academic named Richard Noetstaller, who's a big enemy of progress, but anyway. He produced the report, Small-Scale Mining, A Review of the Issues. Now, Noetstaller himself, even talked to him today, didn't see artisanal and small-scale mining as anything more than a business activity. And this is reflected throughout the document. I think this quote epitomizes this. It therefore rather unhelpfully associated artisanal and small-scale mining exclusively with entrepreneurship, businessmen, get-rich-quick mentality, which we have since come to recognize is not what ASM is about. And an important thing here is that this document was produced at a time where change could have been catalyzed. It was in the middle of an era of integrated rural development where agriculture was being heavily prioritized, where big projects as well were being heavily prioritized. This evolving development agenda at the time really needed to be attacked, okay? It really needed to be challenged. In order for ASM to kind of be considered seriously, it needed to be attacked early on and challenged early on, but it wasn't. We produced this document here. A third point, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, is unhelpful imagery, okay? What has not also helped the case for greater inclusion in the development dialogue is this imagery, okay? I'm talking about negative imagery, to the point where the general public now associates artisanal and small-scale mining with bad things like war, things like corruption, environmental destruction, warlordism. And this has been with us the whole time, okay? First, there was the Brazilian Garimpeiro gold rush, okay, which was insane, okay? Millions of people converging on the Amazon forest, destroying the environment, throwing mercury into the rivers and contaminating the soils, and this really brought the mercury issue to the fore, okay? And just when this kind of started dying down in the late 80s and early 90s, we had the war in Sierra Leone, okay, where diamonds helped to contribute to the lengthening of that civil war. And then when the war ended, you had wars in the Congo over things like coltan, diamonds. So there's always been this kind of negative association. We're always reminded of these things. Then we have like these landmark films like Blood Diamond. So the public is constantly being reminded of these kind of negative things, which isn't helping our case here. So there's this like permanent scar on the conscience of the general public, which makes it very, very difficult to make this convincing case for greater inclusion of the sector in development policy. What also doesn't help is we're preoccupied with transparency in the extractive industries these days. Okay, we seem to think that this is the panacea, that if we improve knowledge of where monies are flowing in Equatorial Guinea, that we can sort that country out, right? Things like the EITI, the Kimberley process, the Dodd-Frank Act. Like these are things we think can help solve the problem. There's certainly a part of the problem, but part of the solution. But I mean, they're not the entire solution. Okay, and when we're talking about transparency and we see these images, it becomes quite problematic. Okay. A fourth point is the orientation of the policy machinery. Despite the dynamic changes that have unfolded in the region's rural areas over the past 40 years, the focus of Sub-Saharan African rural development and poverty alleviation strategy has not changed. It's remained the same. And that's predominantly kind of farm first in its focus. Okay? There seems to be this belief that everyone in Africa wants to be a farmer. They don't want to do anything else. These days, you have to really question how effective this strategy is. Okay? Things are changing by the day. There's a lot going on. So how effective is this farm first strategy? This is a region of the world which attracted 162 of the 288 structural adjustment packages awarded by the World Bank and the IMF before 1981. Adjustment lending being monies awarded in exchange for conformity to a Western economic model. So, you're rolling back the state, you're encouraging privatization, you're scaling back your public services, you're liberalizing your trade, you're removing subsidies on farm inputs, you're dismantling support services for industries like agriculture. Now, adjustment lending intensified in Sub-Saharan Africa in the 80s and the 90s, by which time 37 of the region's countries had implemented a combined 162 adjustment programs, and 22 countries at the moment are still engaged with such lending. That's 36 more than the number adopted elsewhere, combined in the rest of the developing world over the same period. Overall, adjustment lending in Sub-Saharan Africa now exceeds $15 billion. The changes it has brought have helped pave the way for this export-based large-scale mineral economy we see today across the region. Why is this significant? Well, because you're asking people to produce cash crops at devalued prices with less support and to pay for their own fertilizers, which were previously subsidized by the state. Now, this, along with the highly bureaucratic regulatory systems that have been implemented for artisanal and small-scale mining across the region, and which are experiences which are well documented in the literature, has created the informality that we see throughout the sector today. Okay? There's just no incentive to get a license. More specifically, it's spawned in particular an informal gold mining economy that I would argue is today at the core of rural African society, fast replacing smallholder agriculture as the main income earning activity. Continuing on with this point, you started to see change in the mid-1990s. Notably, you had an international roundtable held in Washington, D.C. in 1995, where the idea that there was actually a livelihoods dimension to this industry was introduced and unpacked critically in an international donor and policy forum for the first time. The notion that the growth of the sector was in fact linked to poverty was introduced for the first time. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this particular meeting. Very, very informative, quite dynamic, groundbreaking at the time. So it was the kind of the first time that this whole kind of get-rich-quick mentality was challenged. Okay, that small-scale mining was only about getting rich or businessmen and so on. It was actually challenged for the first time in 1995 in a policy and donor setting. As I've indicated, these issues were debated at length, and a dialogue beyond ASM being just entrepreneurial driven finally began to take shape. You had, as Salim indicated at the beginning, you had the CHASM network beginning to take shape, a supposed mouthpiece for small-scale mining. You had CHASM Latin America, CHASM Asia, and CHASM Africa set up. I was part of the team of 15 people in 2001 at IIED headquarters in London, who helped brainstorm the whole CHASM idea. So it was quite an exciting time. Things were changing, so it appeared. But the momentum generated by this shift was and still is insufficient to challenge the current policy discourse, because by this time, reforms were in full swing, mineral codes were being overhauled or had been overhauled, lands had been auctioned off or were being auctioned off to large-scale mining, leaving very, very few lands available for those small-scale miners who were keen on registering or obtaining licenses, in line with the blueprints outlined in a strategy for African mining. So how could you possibly formalize artisanal and small-scale mining effectively in such a policy setting? And how serious are you about creating a space in policy for small-scale mining? You set up CHASM, fine, but you set it up at World Bank headquarters. Isn't this a conflict of interest? Setting up a unit on the premises of an organization which created these problems to begin with? They're being run by the same, the CHASM was being run by the same people who did nothing in the 1980s and 1990s to connect artisanal and small-scale mining to broader academic and policy debates on rural development. I mean, you had Richard Noetstaller emerge on the scene again. I always maintain that despite the rhetoric, artisanal and small-scale mining is an afterthought in the international development machinery and will continue to be such until the mindset changes. A sixth point is that, I guess, in a way, policy cannot be entirely faulted for not taking into account the many nuances of artisanal and small-scale mining. And let me try to make sense of this here. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, policies have fueled the growth of informal artisanal and small-scale mining. We now know that adjustment lending has been responsible for many thousands of redundancies in privatized industries and scaled down government departments. We also know that it has made it more difficult for the subsistence farmer to survive. The farmer, as I've indicated, now has to pay for fertilizers and other crucial farm inputs. And I think this graphic captures this effectively, okay? If we were to kind of simplify the small-scale mining sector in Africa, you have, who are the participants? You have a bunch of people who are subsisting off farming, who suddenly can no longer subsist off farming alone, and they enter the sector. You have these skilled and educated groups, so thousands of people who have been made redundant under structural adjustment, the accountants, the former public sector workers, and so on, teachers, you see all kinds of people. And then you have the redundant mine workers, the people who've been working in the large-scale mines who have a skill, like a blastman or someone who's been driving a forklift or a dumpster. You find them moving into the sector when they've been made redundant, okay? And this is the thing, we as I indicated at the beginning, we seem to think that it's just about people digging, for gold in the ground, but it's a microeconomy. As you can see, there's jobs for anyone who needs a job here, I'm sure you can find a job in a small-scale mining region, right? Good fun, all kinds of stuff going on, skilled employment, unskilled, all kinds of markets, get some alcohol and drugs, if you're into that, services, all kinds of stuff going on, right? So the question becomes, can donors, or should donors, and policymakers be faulted for not anticipating what their policies created? Because the policies created this problem, or spawned these dynamics, okay? I.e. the growth of an informal artisanal and small-scale mining economy. Okay, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say no, okay? We shouldn't hold them responsible for this, okay? But what they can be faulted for is not doing enough to change things, okay? Once kind of realizing that this has happened and that their policies have been responsible for creating this sector that we see today. And what I'm referring to here, and I'm sure most of you know what a poverty reduction strategy paper is, these documents that are now a requirement of the IMF and the World Bank from recipient developing countries before loans can be dispersed or dispensed. They were initially set up for heavily indebted poor countries, the idea being that the country would produce a document that was country-led by their own ministers, identifying the poverty alleviation priorities, the areas in the greatest need of support and assistance. And the vast majority of HIPC countries are found in Sub-Saharan Africa. But now, poverty reduction strategy papers are required of any country that wishes to get money from the World Bank and the IMF. Now, in the context of artisanal and small-scale mining, these PRSPs, in my opinion, can be divided into 3 generations. Okay, the first generation, or inaugural set of PRSPs, were fairly progressive. Okay, in terms of the dialogue for small-scale mining. Okay, there were signs over a decade ago, when the first PRSP started to emerge onto the scene, that change was on the horizon in this area, that governments finally recognized that there was a livelihoods dimension that we're talking about in the context of small-scale mining. There was a crucial livelihoods dimension that needed to be recognized. For example, probably one of the most illustrative examples being Ghana's first PRSP, an agenda for growth and prosperity, which stated current mining laws tend to disproportionately favor large-scale mining enterprises, and that in order to address this apparent imbalance, measures will be put in place to expand the scope and increase the support to the small and medium-scale subsector with a view to making the predominant means of exploiting minerals in the long term. Now, guys like me got really excited when this came out, you know. It was probably the most comprehensive response, in my view, to the discussion contained in this landmark document here, which basically said that exactly this. It said that the laws and the regulatory setups and the policies in place for large-scale mining and small-scale mining were very different, that small-scale mining was not being treated fairly, that there needed to be more user-friendly regulations implemented for small-scale mining. Okay? It's not just Ghana we're talking about. I mean, if you take a look at Tanzania's second PRSP, and I'm not in the first PRSP, artisanal and small-scale mining wasn't mentioned at all, largely because Tanzania reformed its mining economy much later than Ghana. So I guess we can say that in the context of mining, this PRSP is probably in line with Ghana's first PRSP. But it says, I quote, "There is a need to balance the livelihood requirement of artisanal miners with the economic objectives of the large-scale operators." Good stuff, okay? But then you had a second generation of PRSPs implemented, which replaced the first lot, and these PRSPs took the mining dialogue back to the Stone Age, okay? It kind of unraveled everything that had been kind of built up in the first generation of PRSPs, taking things back to where we were in the 1980s and early 1990s. If you look at Ghana's second PRSP, there's no mentioning of small-scale mining at all in that PRSP. So here we are looking forward to the second PRSP, anticipating that they're going to kind of build on the dialogue that was contained in the first PRSP, and there's no mentioning of small-scale mining at all. Okay, the emphasis in that PRSP, as far as mining goes, is strictly on kind of large-scale mining enclaves, taxing these enclaves, and so on. Okay, in line with everything that was kind of championed and promoted and discussed in a strategy for African mining. Similarly with Tanzania, its most recent PRSP kind of echoes the same views, okay? Bringing the discussion back to the Stone Age, talking about large-scale mining, large-scale export-led growth, unpacking the details of the country's new mining policy, which was implemented in 2009. So you had kind of 2 steps forward and then kind of 3 steps back, and now you have a third generation of PRSP where we're rethinking things once again, okay? So we're kind of back where we started, okay? So we've gone forward, we've gone way back, and now we're kind of back where we started, okay? We're thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to do things a bit differently, okay? So we're in rethink mode in many countries now in the context of artisanal and small-scale mining with specific reference to the poverty reduction strategy paper, okay? Countries such as Ghana are now at this stage, okay? And it's a good thing, okay? We need to think more critically about this sector, okay? But this needs to be managed very effectively, okay? Because we're asking some of the most kind of rentier and or corrupt, unaccountable institutions in the world that are benefiting from the royalties from large-scale mining to put forward a viable plan for artisanal and small-scale mining development that may affect their own pockets. So it requires, or it will require, heavy coordination from NGOs and donors to make this work. And the problem is that donors are still kind of lukewarm on the whole idea of small-scale mining featuring more prominently in the region's development policy. Sometimes I think about this late at night. Is what we see with regards to artisanal and small-scale mining in Sub-Saharan Africa simply the outcome of a broader disconnection? And I'm talking about how mining research and policy in general is undertaken or has been undertaken. And this is something certainly, I think, in my view, worth contemplating. Until the turn of the century, mining research seemed to be mostly about, or was mostly about, science and engineering. At about this time, you had a CSR field in the extractives beginning to take shape, but which initially was largely independent of this body of engineering and scientific work. You also had, in the industry itself, you also had mining engineers and geologists being thrown into CSR jobs without the proper training. You go to these technical mining conferences and give a presentation on community development, and you're looked at like you're an alien, right? You know, you have your social science hat on, and you get all these strange looks, right? And the same happens with the engineer or the geologist who rocks up to a community development mining conference. Like, oh, he's the engineer. He's the geologist, right? The point I'm trying to make is this becomes problematic when you're trying to convince people that making a piece of small-scale mining equipment more efficient or bringing a bunch of miners together is not just a business or technical problem, but rather a development challenge. I'm going to conclude with a couple of case studies which illustrate how things have played out, in my view, as far as support for artisanal and small-scale mining is concerned, and epitomizing how things have been conditioned by this policy mindset in Sub-Saharan Africa. The first is the minimization of releases of organic mercury used to amalgamate gold, as most of you know. This is the sector's biggest problem, okay, by far. There's a ban on mercury exports in effect in the EU and the US, and now you have the Minamata Convention, which will ban mercury from most uses by 2020, ushered through by UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. This will be devastating for small-scale miners in Africa in particular, because, well, what else are they going to use? If we've recognized that this is a poverty-driven sector of industry and you're preventing them from using mercury, what do they do? And we're in this situation today because artisanal and small-scale mining is not a featured element on the international development agenda in the way that it should be. Had it been a featured topic, we would have done more work in the area of alternatives. We would have developed and disseminated alternatives much more effectively than we have to date. Okay? For 30 years, we have been carrying out in this area what I refer to as effects or impacts-oriented research. I'll give you an example. If there's somebody standing in front of a body of water and dumping bleach into that body of water continuously for an hour, chances are there's going to be bleach in the water, right? You don't need $1 million to go figure out that the water's contaminated, right? Well, this is what was going on throughout the 80s. Okay, we found out that the waters were contaminated, but then more and more people were applying for monies, getting grants to go sample streams, to go sample soils where people were clearly dumping mercury into the water or dumping mercury into the soils. We don't need $1 million to figure out that area is contaminated. Okay, it is contaminated. I can tell you without $1 million, although I could use $1 million. Right? Anyway, for 30 years we've been doing this. Okay, a much needed educational technological component only emerged on the scene about 10 to 15 years ago. with the launch of the Global Mercury project. Okay, this was a UNIDO initiative which had many problems, but it kind of brought to the attention of the world that there's a neglected educational component in this whole kind of Mercury area of Mercury research. Okay, let me explain to you what happens when you devise interventions in this area for a group of people who you don't know the first thing about. Does everyone here know what a Mercury retort is? Who doesn't know what a Mercury retort is? Okay. Well, a Mercury retort is this enclosed device. You can build it out of cans. You basically heat the amalgam in an enclosed circuit. It doesn't release any emissions. The gaseous mercury condenses, and then you can kind of capture it as liquid mercury again. So it reduces emissions into the natural environment considerably. Well, the first were implemented in the 1990s by GTZ, the German technical unit in Zimbabwe. These things were made out of local plumbing pipe and sold for about $9 US. Very, very affordable. Okay? They were designed in the lab. But the big complaint coming out of Zimbabwe, where these miners were kind of amalgamating gold along the riverbeds and burning the amalgam in the open air, was that the design is opaque. You can't see it. You can't see the process going on. So a lot of these Zimbabweans were saying that spirits are taking away the gold. Okay? So instead of working with the miners and kind of sensitizing them and working with them, the United Nations commissioned a German company to produce the Thermex retort. Gave them $1 million to produce this glass retort. Okay? Now, what happens when you're walking along a rocky terrain and you drop a glass retort? Right? It breaks. Okay? A glass retort is also, glass is not a good conductor of heat, and it's very, very small, so they weren't very effective. Okay? Let me tell you what happened in Ghana when they distributed these things. Okay? There were very, very low adoption rates. Well, why? What happened was they first went to a community called Tarkwa. They looked at the miners. They saw that the pit owners were amalgamating the gold. So they went all around the community and they gave the pit owners a free Thermex retort. Okay? So all the pit owners, you're amalgamating gold, great, take a Thermex retort. Okay? So the team went to Bolgatanga next. They went around the community. They gave all the pit owners in Bolgatanga a Thermex retort. They went back about a month later, took stock of what was going on in Tarkwa. Some of the guys were using it, some of them weren't. Then they went up to Bolgatanga and they found that they were walking around the communities and they saw some of these glass kind of canisters with plants in them. They saw one guy drinking Milo and tea out of the glass. What was the problem there? Well, the pit owners don't amalgamate gold in this particular community. It's the gold buyers who amalgamate the gold. The point is that you can't assume that what goes on in one area is the same in another area. You have to study the dynamics of these communities. Okay? Too many assumptions, not enough preliminary analysis being conducted. Okay? Second case study, rural livelihoods. And this is simply a case of missed opportunities in my view. You have a poorly contextualized ASM sector in Africa, yet you have a receptive Africa mining vision. This is an initiative that was conceived in 2011 by the African Union. This pathway formulated by African nations themselves that's attempting to put the continent's long-term and broad development objectives at the heart of all policymaking concerned with mineral extraction. It's committed to making artisanal and small-scale mining work for development, but is considerably vague in its objectives because there's very little to work with. There's no context. Okay? And speaking with these guys, no one knows anything about small-scale mining. Okay? They're willing to work and make this work for development and make it more of a priority in policy, but they have no information. There's no census information. There's nothing. They have nothing on hand that helps them kind of that could put them in a position to make kind of effective decisions in these areas. You have the new Partnership for Africa's Economic Development, which is another African Union strategic framework for Pan-African socioeconomic development, but which focuses too much on agriculture and not things like ASM, because that's where the policy dialogue remains. Okay? You have large-scale mining companies from Tanzania to Ghana reaching out to affected artisanal and small-scale mining communities through their CSR to try and support livelihoods. In many cases, identifying alternative livelihoods such as various farming and animal husbandry activities, which poverty reduction strategy papers say should be supported. But these are the activities in reality that these guys are moving out of into small-scale mining. And it's all because no groundwork has been laid in policy. Okay, so some concluding remarks. This is an industry that's very heterogeneous in character, okay? Different people from different backgrounds, different parts of the region. You go to one country and there's people from different countries operating in that particular country in this sector, okay? And you'll never appreciate how heterogeneous the sector is until you study it. The policy dialogue in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa is not in tune with the realities on the ground, okay? In my view, there are several factors preventing greater inclusion of ASM in the African development agenda. Now, things are changing. The World Bank is changing. The various bilateral donors are changing, okay? They're becoming more receptive as far as the issues go in this area. But things, in my view, are still about 2 decades behind. I hope that wasn't too depressing. And I hope I've identified some areas that you may be interested in, or certainly areas that warrant further research for sure.
It's really a very comprehensive presentation, and Gavin has a tremendous repertoire of field knowledge, and so I'm sure there will be questions. We'll go on a little longer than usual, given the breadth of the topic. So, fire away.
My name is Hilson from CSI. Thank you, Gavin, for the presentation. I've got 2 questions, and one relates to I just make a note of one of the slides that you disagreed with one writer in saying that he relates, or he actually associated ASM with business trade. People are reading to ASM because they want the business or the change of business. So my question is that why do you think people from agricultural sector or tourism sector, I understand that some people are made redundant and they make a choice to go to mining, but people, especially in Africa, most people that go into ASM come from agricultural sector. Why do you think they are creating this kind of sector? Is it something that can drive a better livelihood for them? I just want to understand why. I'm not trying to say that I agree with the guy that says that it's a business tale. I do believe that it is also a cause for improvement. And my second question is that by acknowledging first that keeping agreement to artisanal mining, doesn't that actually help push this issue better? Because you first acknowledge that people are going into this sector because they want to improve their livelihood. And by acknowledging that first, you can actually improve or get more attention into the sector and get something done.
Okay, I mean, I think just I guess some clarification needed. You find that, in my experience, that the people moving from farming into mining are not abandoning farming altogether. In fact, they're undertaking, in most cases, they're undertaking mining seasonally. But the reason why they're moving into mining is because farming can no longer support them in a liberalized market. Okay? I mean, they have no access to markets. They're competing with big firms. They're producing cash crops that no longer fetch the payments that they previously fetched. So it's no longer viable to stick with agricultural law. Mining, I showed you that there was that diagram I had. It's important, I guess, to recognize that there's a job for everyone, right? Like you go into some of the camps and you find people working security for, I don't know, $300 US a month or a week, or whatever period of time. They're going to get that amount of money no matter what. I mean, it doesn't depend on the performance of the mine. They're going to get that amount of money no matter what. And that kind of income can enable them to do things that they couldn't do previously. They're just like you and I. I mean, you go to some of these communities and you speak to an illiterate farmer and you ask him where his kids are, and he'll say, "Oh, they're not here. Why aren't they here?" Well, because it's a dangerous work. And these farmers, they can't speak, they're illiterate, they didn't go to school, but their kids are in the best schools in Africa. Because of the monies from the mining, they're thinking about their children, right? So you think to yourself, is that a good thing? Is that something that we should support? And in my view, that is something we should support. And how do you support that? You support that by getting to your second question, by recognizing that these people should be at the heart of development strategy. So by doing that and recognizing that we're dealing with individuals, not individual industries or activities, that these people have comprehensive livelihood portfolios, that we're dealing with individuals here, I think that's a starting point, I think.
And I'm just wondering if you've seen any promising activities around engaging ASM workers. I'm just thinking of a case in Peru where there's a mid-range mining company that's looking to create a section of their concession and legalise the miners that are working there currently illegally. And then they're taking that gold and processing it on site to make it more environmentally
Mm-hmm.
and trying to create an inclusive sort of framework for those people. Have you seen, there are obviously issues with that as well, but have you seen any kind of examples of promising arrangements?
I mean, there have been attempts made. I've been doing some work in Mali, and there's been attempts made attempts being made in Mali right now. And there have been attempts made in Ghana to partner with small-scale miners and to perhaps buy their gold and equip them with security cards and everything. But I mean, the problem is, if you look at a country like Ghana, for example, where I don't know what the level of sophistication is in Peru with the small-scale miners, but in Ghana we're talking about really rudimentary, like sluice boxes, and so on. The problem is that if all the mining companies don't do this, what you're going to have happen is people just migrating from place to place, and it is a migratory industry, right? So, and that's how they see it. That's how the miners see it. So, if you want to kind of get it right, it all has to go through the Chamber of Mines, the big mining companies, and everyone has to do the same thing. And that's why, for example, in Ghana, an attempt was made by Goldfields in Tarkwa, in one of the mining areas, to do this, to buy the gold from these guys, to equip them with security cards and everything. But it was done at a time when the gold price was low, and the area that they kind of allowed them to work in, it wasn't viable for the mining company to work in that area. And that was when I think gold was like $350 an ounce, and now it's like 4 times the price. So now they're having issues with the miners. An attempt was made by Newmont in Ghana as well to partner with some of these guys as well, and it didn't work. And I think part of the problem, sorry, I'm just kind of random ideas here. Part of the problem as well is we don't seem to recognize as researchers sometimes that the company itself is nuanced, that we're dealing with various layers. So what the people say on the ground, what these guys face every day, some of these CSR managers, I think some of them are they genuinely want to help these people. But then when they go to the next level, it's a more difficult sell. And by the time you get back to Denver or London or Johannesburg, it's an impossible sell. So it has to be an integrated process, I think. And I think that's an area which requires more work as well, broadening understanding of those dynamics, the whole decision-making process. A final point is just the dynamic of the large-scale gold mining sector. I mean, you go to some communities in Ghana where I do most of my work, and you have people in a community like Demang, which is near Tarkwa, and these guys are referring to the same company by 20 different names. You go to one guy and he says, "Oh, that's Pioneer Mining." Go to an expert, that's Ghana Australia mining, gold mining. That's Ghana Goldfields. It's because the ownership changes so much that these guys, they're told one thing by one person, and then when that company's taken over, there's a completely different policy. So, I'm not gonna. I have my views on the social license to operate in these settings, but we could talk about that later. But this is a problem as well. So.
Can we take a few questions together and then wrap it up?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Catherine Stone from Sub-Saharan. You spoke broadly about the development assistance agenda overlooking ASM, but could you comment specifically on the Australian and Canadian mining for development initiatives and how to get them to pay more attention or channel more funding to ASM? On the one hand, there's not a lot of business mileage to be gained from that if you're cynical about the national interest-driven donor assistance. But on the other hand, there's also not a lot that the mining industries here in Canada can teach Africa about ASM. And all the African government participants who come here on the mining development study tours ask for more information and policy on ASM, but how do we get those initiatives engaged on ASM?
I just have two questions. You talked about economic succession leading to a disruptive dimension of the systems. But there is another component, corruption, which is heavily practiced by the government authority as well as the big mining companies, leading to that. That issue has not been addressed. So I was wondering whether that's an issue. And another thing is donor community, they are being investing towards the health and safety of these workers. Like, is there any funding or anything that goes on to address that?
Okay. Well, going back to, CSR is kind of a back and forth issue with regards to mining in Africa. You'll have a company say, well, we're not the government, and even though we're kind of calling on these companies to do more, right? And it's kind of a back and forth thing, right? But I think my view on this is that these companies obviously know what they're getting. They're operating in Africa for a reason, because it's despite what the regulations say, despite what they claim they're doing with regards to level of operation. They're operating there because it's clearly more profitable to operate there than, say, Australia or Canada. But the bottom line is, whatever your view is on the social license to operate, it all boils down to CSR monies, okay? CSR monies have been, there have been monies, X amount of monies earmarked for CSR purposes by every company that, whether it's Australian, Canadian, South African, or whatever. Now, my view is that these CSR monies can be used much more productively. These people don't want a library in a place where there's no librarian, or they don't want a school where you can't find teachers to teach in that school. They don't want these kind of white elephant projects. What they want is a viable economic activity. Now, what needs to be done is these large-scale mines. I understand how they work. They get a lease for 40 years, and they determine that X part of the lease can be mined profitably for 20 years, and they do concurrent exploration on other parts of the lease. Well, if they're genuinely committed to CSR and if they pledged X number of dollars to doing something in that area, then they should identify the areas that are alluvial areas, for example, that they're not going to touch, and free up those areas, or work with the government to free up those areas for small-scale miners. I think that's the best thing that Canadian companies and Australian companies could do. And I think it needs to start from the exploration phase. I mean, these exploration companies need to be on board with this as well. Sorry, you want to follow up with that?
My question is actually about the donor, also agency funds for mining and how those can be done.
How they can be channeled for ASM.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, well, it's really problematic at the moment because these agencies, along with other bilateral agencies, are pledging significant amount of monies towards supporting ASM. But the problem is that these monies are earmarked for licensed operators. Okay, so these 99.9% of the miners, small-scale miners in Africa, cannot access this support. Okay, this is why I'm sure you've seen all these issues with the Chinese in West Africa and the small-scale mining sector. These are why these problems have come about. Okay, and I can explain that a bit later on. But so I don't think on their own they're capable of doing anything. Okay, but if those changes are made by the mining companies, working in tandem with the government and the World Bank, which is changing. I mean, I've criticized the World Bank for all my life, but you know, it is changing with regards to small-scale mining policy or its small-scale mining policy. Then these initiatives that are being undertaken by AusAid and CEDA will certainly be more effective. I don't think they need to change anything, to answer your question, because they're providing the support in terms of technical support. They're providing equipment. They're providing or willing to provide assistance in the area of mercury management, for example. So I don't think anything needs to change. And I don't think they're capable of changing the things I've just kind of alluded to on their own. Going back to your question, the resource curse. I've just identified one strand of the resource curse. I always tell my students to think of the resource curse, the whole idea that counterintuitively these poor developing countries these resource-rich developing countries are not performing well economically. Think of the resource curse as a tree, okay, with many branches. So there's many reasons why these countries are underperforming economically. One branch is the institutional strand, or the institutional branch, which you've alluded to, the corruption, the institutions, and so on. But, I mean, a lot of the resource curse literature focuses exclusively on the economics. And the point I was trying to make is that by focusing solely on the economics and looking at the performance of these companies, of these countries, you're overlooking those other branches. One being the social dimension, another being the institutional strand that you've alluded to, and there's a number of other strands as well. Your second question was on health and safety. Well, I mean, informal small-scale mining, I mean, it's not recognized by government, despite the fact that many politicians are involved in the sector. I didn't say that. It's not supported by government, we'll say. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Gavin. If there are other questions informally, Gavin is with us this afternoon and tomorrow as well, part of tomorrow. So please use this opportunity to learn from him, and we look forward to opportunities to collaborate with him as well on this area.